Our gospel reading this week is from John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had heard this, Jesus spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And the man said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been born blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" The man answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" They reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are blind. Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." This is our text. So the first thing that struck me when I read through this passage is there are so many questions and attempts at explanation. The disciples started with a question that made the assumption that the blindness was the fault of either the man or his parents. The disciples assumed that anyone who was born with or developed a physical ailment was suffering from the sins committed by previous generations. Jesus immediately rejected this idea. For Jesus, sin is not about morality or following the law, but rather about relationship with God. Through the course of this story, it becomes clear that to be in sin is to not be in relationship with God, or to not believe that God is present in Jesus. Just as quickly as Jesus rejected the idea that sin had caused this man to be born with blindness, Jesus performed the miracle of healing the man and allowing him to see for the first time in his life. The man's entire life was transformed by this healing. Physically, his life would have been made immensely easier, and I imagine he was in awe of simply being able to see the world around him. Socially, he would have been able to enter into society rather than sitting on the roadside begging and being ignored by people. And spiritually, the man would have known for the first time in his life that he was a human being created by God and worthy of being in relationship with God. The man came to experience abundant life because of the healing. This miracle happens in just 2 verses, and then the rest of this chapter focuses on the reaction of the disciples and the religious leaders. The man who was born with blindness came with no preconceptions and no assumptions about who God was or how God works in the world. However, the crowds, the disciples, and the Pharisees were spiritually blind. They came with so much assumptions, and they reacted to hostility to Jesus and to the man born with blindness. And this reveals just how much was at stake for them in trying to make sense of what Jesus had done. They wanted to explain the man's blindness so that they could make sense of the world. The religious leaders attempted to make a world where there are answers, and a world where they were right and knew those answers. The Pharisees tried to use logic to explain what happened. They asked about Jesus' origin because the logic was that since Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he clearly could not be from God. Their belief that only God can heal on the Sabbath indicates they didn't believe that Jesus was from God. But there was something bigger and unexplainable at stake here, a sense of control over what happens in the world. The disciples and the religious leaders had hoped that the man's blindness could be explained as a punishment for something that he or his parents had done. This would have provided an easy explanation in a sense that illness, disability, or suffering can be prevented by following the laws. But the reality that Jesus revealed is one that is filled with mystery and is destabilizing. The truth Jesus confirmed is that neither the religious leaders nor any human has any control over what happens. The religious leaders were so caught up in trying to trick Jesus and to be right and have the answers and divide the world into right and wrong. They were so caught up that they were unable to see the man born with blindness as a human being rather than as a problem to be solved. No one celebrated with the man when he was finally able to see. And furthermore, the religious leaders were so worried about trying to explain everything and make the world into a place that is fair and in their control, that they failed to experience the very presence of God standing right in front of them. They couldn't even see the miracle of the fact that God had just given sight to a man who had never seen anything in his life. Jesus is in this scene making a mess, literally spreading mud on a man's eyes. And then the man was able to see, and his entire life was transformed from a life of no hope, a life of begging, to a life in which he was a witness and a disciple of Jesus. And no one, not even the man's parents, responded with awe or wonder or even gratitude at the miracle. The man was the only one who fully appreciated what happened to him. And he responded by entering into a relationship with Jesus, who he recognized as fully God. For the man, believing in Jesus wasn't an intellectual or cognitive move. It was a relationship. The man had an encounter with Jesus, and as a result, he came to know Jesus. He knew Jesus as someone who cared enough to stop and talk with him. The man knew Jesus as someone who had power to allow him to physically see. The man knew Jesus as someone who had transformed his entire life. The man knew Jesus as God. This man who had been born blind had a clear before and after. Before, he was unable to see. After his encounter with Jesus, he was no longer blind. Before, the man had no hope of a meaningful future, and after, he became a witness to God's miracles. Yet we are in the messy middle of life. We struggle to make sense of all that happens around us, and I think it is a natural human response to want to explain and have control over what happens. Like the Pharisees, our world is turned upside down when something happens to us or someone we know that reveals logic, and applying the law just won't work. And so we remain without an after, with the reality of the unexplainable, which is so often painful. Yet it is clear that God works through the extraordinary, like healing a man born blind. But God also works through the ordinary, like spit and mud. Both the extraordinary and the ordinary reveal that God works in unexpected ways. Mysteries remain. We don't have all the answers and probably never will. Yet there are miracles happening every day, and God is working in our midst, transforming us and the world around us. Each day we are given an opportunity and a choice to either see God or to choose to refuse to see God in the unexpected and surprising ways. And so we must ask, can we look outside the box we have put God in, the box in which we are uncomfortable? What or who might we see if we were willing to enter into the messiness of faith, our faith in Jesus? Who might we see if we are willing to accept that there are no easy answers, and that some questions and mysteries will remain? Lent is often viewed as a time to re-examine our lives. And this text invites us to re-examine how we think about and look for God in the world. Do we go about with the assumption that we know who God is and how God works? Or are we open enough to be surprised by God? Are we open enough not to get caught up in right or wrong or an easily explainable world so that we can allow the mysteries and power of God to remain? So I pray that we might be brave enough to look at our own vulnerability and our own mortality with the trust that God will be with us, even in our darkest hour. May we dare to see and expect God in unexpected ways. And may we respond in delight when we recognize the surprising way that God works around us. And when the mysteries remain while we endure the messy middle of this life, may we find faith to hold on until we see. Amen.